Same old Emmerdale. Nothing changes.
It's not really true, though, is it? You've changed. I'm starting to forget what that smile looked like before we left.
Yeah, it's because I've got something to smile about now, despite the weather. Starting to wonder if we should ever come back.
It's our home, Robert. Or at least it will be when you move in.
Welcome back! Hope you had a great holiday.
Yeah, best ever.
Well, let's hope your crazy ex doesn't turn up again and ruin things.
It's not going to happen.
Seem pretty confident, considering he's a head case.
Well, Kev's wanted by the police. He's not going to show his face around here again, is he?
Look, forget him, right? He's our past. We're concentrating on our future, which you might be able to help with, because we've decided that it's time I move in here.
Oh. Well, I guess I should say I'm going to miss you, but I'm not going to miss cleaning up your mess. In fact, come on and I'll help you move the rest of your stuff over.
Right.
It really was a good holiday, wasn't it?
Feel ready for a fresh start.
It sounds like a good reason for a Christmas fat warming party.
Especially if we get Seb over for the day.
Yeah, I think that might be a bit too much to hope for.
You changed your tune.
Yeah, I know, I think I got a bit carried away with it all.
You said you thought it was a good idea to contact his Auntie Angela over Christmas.
Yeah, I know, but Sam doesn't really know me, does he? And Angela might say that I've not really made much effort to contact him before, so...
But she knows you've been away for a while.
Well, yeah, but I'm an ex-con fresh out of prison. It's not really going to make her trust me, is it?
You're trying to build a new life and you want your son to be a part of it. What's wrong with that?
I've still got to convince Angela to let me be part of his life.
We've got to convince her, and we won't know until we ask her, will we?
Yeah, I know. I know.
We'll put these back under the bed.
Yeah, maybe I'll come give you a hand.
That's fine, don't worry. You okay?
Yes. Still no reply from Angela about us meeting up with Seb.
Maybe she's just getting ready for Christmas. Hello?
Let me in, will you?
Wow. It's Ross.
I thought he was still in Liverpool.
Well, it doesn't sound like it, does it?
What are you doing?
What?
Texting Angela, trying to get Seb back. Yeah, she told me. So? What are you playing at?
Ross, will you just calm down?
No! You didn't want him. You signed him away.
Yeah, because I have no idea if I was ever even going to get out again.
And what? Ever since your life has been nothing but peachy. How many psycho husbands have tried to kill you both lately?
How's that our fault?
Well, it's certainly not Seb's, is it?
This is ridiculous. Angela should never have told you about this in the first place.
Why not? I've been more of a dad to that kid than he ever has.
Yeah, and I thanked you for that.
I don't want your thanks. I just want him to be happy.
He might be happy here.
Oh, give over. This isn't about Seb. This is about you two.
No, it isn't. You're wrong.
If you really want the best for that kid, you would leave him be. Angela has given him a stability that none of us ever could. So that's why I told her she'd be insane to let you back in his life. Either of you.
You did what?
You heard.
Maybe he has a point.
What's up with you? Not stuck in traffic or something?
It's Robert and Aaron. They're trying to get Seb back.
Oh.
Yeah. That kid's been through enough already. He needs a quiet life, not what those two idiots would give him.
Oh, no.
Who do you think you are, you? Trying to get in Robert's head? He made his mind up and now.
What? He's having second thoughts? That just proves my point. Maybe me giving him a few home truths shouldn't be enough to make him dump his son before he's even got him back.
You don't even know what you're talking about.
Right, OK, enough. Just get going, you. Go on.
What? I haven't done anything.
Well, I'm trying to keep it that way. You need to keep your cool, the pair of you.
Fine. But I'm not just going to stand by and let you ruin that kid's life just because you two got bored.
Robert, listen to me. I'm telling you, I didn't start anything. It was him. Just do me a favour, ignore him, will you? And just phone Angela back. We'll just... No, I'm still here. Someone smashed my windscreen. Well, who do you think it was? It was Ross.
I can't believe they didn't tell you they were reaching out to Angela. I get you're away, but...
I'm not surprised. As far as they're concerned, I'm nothing to Seb.
Are you upset?
Of course I am. Giving him up was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Didn't just feel like I was letting him down.
Felt like I was letting Rebecca down too. I just don't think that Robert and Aaron having him is the right thing. I really don't. I don't think I could see him around the village all the time and not have anything to do with him. It'd kill me.
You're pathetic, you.
All right, we're doing this again, are we?
Do you think this is funny or something?
Why can't you just stop and just get out?
It's got nothing to do with you.
Okay, and what was he meant to have done?
Smash my car up.
What? No, I never.
You know what? You bang on about Seb being better off without us. Maybe that's because you know we'd be better off being a million miles away from you. And I also reckon Rebecca knew that. That's why she dumped you.
If you talk to me like that ever again, I'll do a lot worse than smash your car up.
So you admit it then? You're gonna pay for this.
Look, I know you spoke to Ross, and I know he's not had a lot of good things to say about me. Yeah. Yeah, I can't deny any of that, and I've made a lot of mistakes. Loads of them. But not getting to know my own son is probably the biggest of all of them, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try and fix that, so that's what I'm doing now. I'm calling you and hoping that you're going to find it within yourself to give me a chance. Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Bye.
So?
She says she doesn't think it's a good idea. But she says that she thinks we should meet up, the three of us, me, you and her, and get to know each other a bit and see where we go from there.
Really?
Yeah. I might get to see my boy soon. Angela's suggesting a pub halfway on Christmas Eve. Apparently Seb's already got a party to go to that day.
Are you sure you want me coming?
Yeah, of course I do. I won't be here without you. What are you doing?
Nothing that concerns you?
Joe?
Hey, you weren't answering your phone, so I didn't have a chance to talk.
What are you wearing? Who's this?
Okay, so that's what you're doing.
Can you give us some space, please?
Nah.
Oh dear, what is this?
Looks like you might have got the wrong end of the stick.
So how about you get behind the bar, Bob, while I watch little Miss Sunshine contemplate ruining her life?
This is why I didn't want to do this here. I had a whole plan at the cottage. It was really romantic.
What are you talking about?
You deserve so much more than this. But I didn't have time.
Say no.
You are the most important person in my entire life. Would you do me the honor? Marry me?
I'm sorry. I can't.
It's embarrassing, isn't it?
Well, good job we didn't do it anywhere public.
Oh, Joe. You hear that? World's smallest violin.
What the? Get some water. I'll use my coat.
Well, we know who this is.
Aaron.
But it's Ross, isn't it? He did my windscreen yesterday. I told you about all these threats.
That was just calm down, will you? You don't know that it's him for sure.
What do you think you're playing at?
Do you want to give me a clue?
You know what I'm talking about. My car yesterday, now you're setting fire to trees outside my house.
You what? No, I haven't. Mate, I've been here all morning. How on earth would I have done that?
I can vouch for that.
Maybe there's like an arsonist elf going round.
If I find out it was you, you're dead. It won't be a warning next time either.
Who's there? Kev, I know it's you.
Feels a bit weird being back in here with you.
Well, that makes two of us.
I am sorry about all that. It's got very, very emotional. You know what I mean? How's your arm?
Yes, getting better.
I mean, good, because I'm sorry about that. That was an accident. I didn't mean to do that.
I suppose the fire, that was you, was it? And Aaron's car yesterday.
No comment, you know that.
It's not funny, Kev.
I'm sorry about that too. But I am a persistent man, Robert. You know that. Think, you know all that stuff you said about how it was always going to be Aaron? I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it is.
No. No, it's not, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I just don't believe you.
It's the truth, Kev.
Now, I don't think that I'm prepared to accept that.
Yeah, well, you don't have a choice.
We all have choices, suckers.
Right, I think you should leave now.
Oh, I've only just got here. So, I've been putting in the work, you know, like that prison counsellor said, and I've changed. I'm a new man, and you don't need to be scared of me.
You were waving a sword around last time I saw you.
Yeah, that was just a little blip.
Kev, you need to move on. Right? You can still have a great life without me.
I've got no life without you.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
You haven't even tried properly.
No, and I'm not going to. Look, I came back here for you, and I'm not going to take no for an answer.
Well, you're going to have to. I'm sorry, Kev, but it really is over.
No.
What?
I said no. I just don't do this. Look, if you're really not going to take me back, then just hand me into the police, put me out of my misery.
I'm not going to call the police. But I do want you gone. Immediately, and I don't want you ever coming back.
I don't think I can do that.
Me and Aaron are together, right, Kev? And the sooner that you accept that, the better it's going to be for everyone.
What if I don't want to accept that?
Drink that, calm down, will you?
You've got it really lovely in here, haven't you? All cosy and Christmassy.
Thanks.
No, it's nice. Huh. No? I reckon I'd be better off back in a prison cell.
You don't need to go back to prison, Kev. You can make a go of it somewhere.
Like where?
Anywhere, with someone who really appreciates you.
Yeah, okay.
No, Kev, I mean it. You're a good guy. And someone out there will see that.
You know what? You are an absolute belter. Suckers, you're really very, very special.
I'm really not.
No, you really are. I mean, after everything that I've done to you, you can still make me a cup of tea, do all this.
I want us to part on amicable terms.
So there's really no chance for us, no?
No, Kev. You hurt me because you were angry. That's not love, it's control. We bring the worst out in each other.
Yeah. So that's that then.
Yeah, I think so.
Just, move on. Go our separate ways.
It's for the best.
Still, good while it lasted though, innit? Eh? We'll just have to hold on to the memories.
So you had it out with Ross then?
Yeah. He swears blind it wasn't him. Christmas trees, all the windscreens got alibis and everything.
He's telling the truth.
And how do you know that?
I'm going to tell you something. But I need you to promise that you're not going to get angry, right?
Oh, well, that depends.
It's Kev. He turned up again.
What, when?
Earlier today, he just appeared out of nowhere.
So it was him that did the Christmas tree on my windscreen?
Well, yeah, he pretty much admitted it.
And what did the police say?
Nothing.
No, because you've not told them, have you?
He was in a bad place, right? So I brought him in here.
You did what?
We talked it through.
In here? The same place where I nearly sliced your arm off? We had to go away for ages because of him, and you just invite him back in here?
I didn't know what else to do.
He's just as crazy as he is.
Will you just hear me out? He got the message, right? I don't think we'll ever see him again.
And what makes you say that?
Because he's finally realised that it's over, that he can have a better future with someone else.
He comes back here again, you tell me straight away next time.
All right, fair enough.
I mean it. The minute he shows his face.
All right. Message received, loud and clear. But I really do think I got through to him. Honestly, that he's gone for good.
We need to report Kev to the police.
I've explained this. He's not a threat to us anymore.
He set fire to our trees. He's going to smash my windscreen. And what happens if he follows us to meet Angela?
He won't. He's not going to cause us any more grief.
And you honestly believe that?
Hey, what time you have to see Angela?
There's no point going now.
Why not?
Well, how can she trust that we'll look after Seb when his psycho ex waging a war of terror?
I ain't got time for this. I'm going to work.
Yeah, perfect. Very mature of you. Just walk away from it all, yeah? He's got to let Kev off the hook.
You're playing right into his hands. Kev's trying to tear the two of you apart and you're letting him.
So you think I should back down?
Yes, I do. Because today isn't about Kev or Ross, it's about Angela. And proving that you can look after Seb if you want him back where he belongs. So please, go and sort it out.
Vic reckons I should apologise.
And you agree with her?
I just want Kev out of our lives.
Yeah, so do I. We could report him, but that would mean spending Christmas Eve at a police station giving statements. When you'd rather meet up with Angela. Show what a great couple we are.
When you put it like that, yeah.
Kev's the past. Right, he's not in our lives anymore. The future is me, you, and Seb. What was that?
Get down, get down.
What's going on? What's happened?
Kev tried to kill us.
What?
Yeah, we're in a field and we were shot at.
And it was definitely Kev.
This would never have happened if you'd have called the police yesterday.
Well, please tell me that you've called them now.
Yeah, obviously. We still need to stay inside with the doors locked until they get here.
And what about Angela?
Well, Kev might follow us to the meeting and go after her. So we're just gonna have to put it off until they find him.
We've done a full sweep of the area. Whoever was out there has gone now.
Well, if Kev comes back.
He's trying to kill us.
Did you actually see Mr. Townsend?
No, we didn't see anyone.
Who else could it be?
Well, there's been a lot of poachers recently.
They've been targeting local farms and estates.
And it's not poachers, it's Kev. You need to find him.
We're already looking for Mr. Townsend. It's only a matter of time now until we track him down.
And meanwhile, he's free to take pop shots at us, is he?
But can you actually prove that he fired the shots?
Useless.
He's doing all he can.
Look, we'll investigate this thoroughly. Patrol the village for the rest of the day. Just try not to worry. It's easier said than done, I know. I'll let myself out.
Hiya, it's only us. Come on.
All right, Harry. Shouldn't you be in bed, son?
Well, I put him to bed hours ago.
I'm not tired.
So I'm relying on you two to wear him out. Go sit down for me.
We'll do our best, but as long as you feel safe being here.
Full disclosure, I feel safer here than I do at home. Do you mind if we stay for a while? I keep thinking that Kev's gonna come after us.
No, of course not, it's fine. You do know we won't let Kev anywhere near either of you, though, don't you?
Thanks.
You already gave us a card.
Oh, that's not from me. I found it downstairs on the mat.
What is it?
Kev's wedding ring.
Is that a bullet?
He's not going to stop until he kills us. Expecting a shot any time.
It's a public street, and it's on Christmas Day.
So that means it's not allowed, is it?
Merry blah blah. Why don't you have some of this muck?
Wow, salesperson of the year.
Cheers.
Hi, love. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Looks like we should be singing Feed the World.
We will not be caught with insufficient food, will we?
Look at all those vegetables. I know.
You're not wearing your present.
No, I will.
Right, come on. Let the peeling commence. After you, Governor.
What present has he got that you can't wear out here?
Do we really want to know?
He got me a cardi
Right, because you're 74 years of age.
and a murder mystery thing.
Where have you got to go for that?
Oh, I don't know, some hotel in Weatherfield.
Where?
Oh, God knows.
Weatherfield?
Never heard of it.
Question, how come I didn't get a scooter?
Spent enough on your My Little Pony, thank you.
Got another one, love.
Yeah, go on then.
Not for me. I've actually got somewhere to nip off to.
Where are you going? Robert, where are you going?
Hey, Merry Christmas. Where's Eve?
She's upstairs with Harry.
Doing what?
I don't know, do I?
Oh, you got it on. It looks wonderful.
Yeah, you'll fit right in it, WI.
Right, come on, Cardi B, get some of these pigs.
How many are we feeding?
Did Robert come round to yours?
No. Why? Did he say he was gonna?
Well, he's just got off and now he's not answering his phone.
What, at all?
What do you mean at all? He's not going to answer it a little bit, is he?
Don't get crabby.
Well, I'm worried, Vic. So where is he now, then?
I don't know.
Don't worry about Robert, love.
Well, you would if you knew that Kev's back firing guns.
What?
What, he's back?
Someone took a shot at us yesterday
Where was this?
at Butler's. The police reckon it was just poachers and they were stray shots.
Yeah, well, they're probably right.
Yeah, until we got back and there was an envelope with Kev's wedding ring and a bullet in it.
Oh, my goodness.
Do you reckon we should go and look for him?
I was just gonna suggest it, actually.
No, hang on. Where are you even going to look?
I don't know.
We can't just sit here.
Maybe you should call the police?
And say what? That my fully grown adult boyfriend's been missing for a couple of hours.
Well, I think I'd also suggest the shooting, the bullet in the ring.
Have you forgotten how to count?
I tried to prepare for everything beyond the extent of preparation. Do you know who said that?
Nelson Mandela.
Taylor Swift.
Right, come on, let's go look for him. Chaz, can you watch Harry?
No need.
But he's about to turn 6, not 6. Finally!
You knew I was nipping out?
And where have you been getting your phone fixed? Been calling you.
Oh, because I've been gone a couple of hours.
And it's been longer than that.
Well, it must have been on silent. Sorry.
Well, it's just, we thought, you know...
Kev had got you. Told us about yesterday.
What? No, don't worry about that. I'm done with that madman interfering with our lives.
Hello, hello.
Hey!
Festive greetings.
Oh, hiya. Merry Christmas. I thought you were off seeing Steph.
No, it's tomorrow. Are we all right?
Yes, don't worry. The Taylor Swift Appreciation Society has got it all covered.
Got you in that sparkly dress again.
You wish.
Oh, you come bearing gifts.
How come you're suddenly not worried anymore?
Because what's the point? It's Christmas. Relax.
Right, well, come on then. Who are you? Why have you done this? Have you lost your tongue, yeah? Oh, no, wait, that's right. Not yet, you haven't, because I'm going to cut it off, and that's just for the start.
Well, that's a big threat. From a man in your very precarious position.
You know, I know who you are.
Yeah. Saves on introductions.
Johnny Psycho, the murderer.
Not true.
That kid wraps himself up in tarpaulin and jumps in the lake, did he, yeah?
Show some respect. That kid had a name. Nate. And his death was an accident.
Right. That will not be why nobody hates you then. Nobody refers to you as a massive nutter. Not very popular, were you?
Now, truth be told, I made some mistakes. I let things slip. But now I'm going to make up for it. The storm's coming. Not literally, idiot.
Read.
You caused a bit of one though, didn't you? What with your little siege? Yeah, I read all about that in the news. Sword, very visually arresting. Not quite as effective as a bullet, though. I came this close to putting one through your husband's head yesterday. Just after I drugged you and stopped you shooting my husband.
No, I was so wrong about you. You're completely mentally stable. Aaron really does not know what he's missing.
Aaron is not going to miss out on anything. He knows where his future lies. But there's a bit of work to be done first, though. So this is your little squat, is it? You know, like what you've done with the place. Well, I see. Yours, it's mine now.
Well, it suits you. Just need to knock together a little padded cell for you. Because that's where you're ending up.
I'm ending up with Aaron. Together like we are meant to be. Happy, content, and committed to each other. With you and Robert nowhere to be seen by anyone ever again.
Effort, that, Liam. You know, I've always thought of eat and mess as one of those terrible games that they play at boarding school.
Oh! Well, it's a good thing we finished our food before you gave us that disgusting image.
Kindred spirits. Ah, cute.
I am actually, yeah. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find an engraved on Christmas Day?
So is that where you've been? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, is this a private party?
Doesn't have to be. Sit down.
We didn't want to intrude.
No, not at all. Is Mary not with you?
Nah, she's
She's a very keen Scrabble player.
very keen and serious.
We didn't lie to her. I said I wanted to check on Kevin.
Ah.
To see if he'd checked in with you at all. Has he?
No.
I got a card. Just said Kay. I know what he's done, but no one should be alone at this time of
Do
year.
you want a drink?
Ooh, I reckon Claudette could be trouble on bubbles.
I'm not. I'm Randy on Shandy. I'll have a Shandy. No, just joking. Or am I?
Cheers, everyone.
Well, just hang on a sec. Ooh, I'm not really a fan of publicly humiliating myself.
Oh, well, that's not true, but carry on.
Ah, it's good. It's very good. I just wanted to say this year has been a bit, well, I mean, even by our standards, it's been a weird one. It's been hard, mostly. And very hard. Sometimes. Scary. And it's been sad. But it's also been amazing. And although most of you are a pain in the backside, you're family. We're family. And I'm glad we've got each other. So, you know, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
To family. Well, and you.
Like I didn't exist. That's better. Big day, eh? Big year. And I thought it was going to be the best year ever, but...
Yeah, I'll go and check. Won't be a sec. No, he's fine. He won't be tomorrow, but that's his problem.
So many people care about you, but Not one of them as much as I do. 2025 has been a shocking year, but 26, no. That is going to be the best year ever. Because you and me, we're going to be together. No matter what. Know thine enemy. First rule of war. Which is why I think I'll keep you where you are.
So this is a war then, yeah? Cool. I think Robert was right about you. There's therefore something seriously going wrong in your brain.
Well, the difference between you and me is that you're a blunt instrument. I'm trained for this.
So what exactly is your plan? Well, go on then. Tell me all about it. I know you're gagging to.
Yeah, a bit busy right now. Things to do, people to get in my sights. You know how it is. I didn't want this. But you and your little revenge scheme got in my way.
Oh, sorry.
I might as well use it to my advantage.
Oh. Not if I've got anything to do with it, you won't.
You keep telling yourself that.
Like we said, there's every indication that what you heard was poachers.
Poachers? Right, okay, and what did they think we were? Rabbits?
Look, we've already put out a full description. Ports and airports have all been alerted. If your husband's out there, we'll find him.
And what if he starts taking pot shots in the meantime? Or even worse, one of them actually hits us?
Look, I'm afraid we found nothing significant in the woods to indicate that it was him.
All right. That is Kev's wedding ring. And that is a bullet. Is that significant enough for you?
Like, I know this must be unnerving. Without any proof of intent or ownership. But does the ring have an inscription?
No.
Then I'm afraid it proves nothing.
Look, thanks for the update. We appreciate it, as it's Christmas. If we can think of anything else, we'll let you know.
Likewise. For now, just try not to worry.
Brilliant, thanks. A waste of time that was.
Come on, I know you're scared.
Scared? I'm not scared. I'm wound up. There's a big difference. It's our first Christmas back together and Kev's ruining it.
That'll be Vic. I told her we'd go for a Boxing Day walk, but if you don't want to, then...
Well, let that little psycho win. No chance.
Big call for parts or anything. I told you to wear your Christmas long guns. Hey? That's it. Smile your last smile. Hey! Hey, guess what? Santa left one last present round at our house. How cool's that? Go on.
Who wants to go to the cafe for a hot chocolate?
I've already got my Christmas drink right here in its very own hip flask, thanks to Robert. Obviously not for Harry, but...
No, it sounds good to me. Robert, you up for it?
You okay? Well, yeah, no, I just thought I heard something.
Well, Father Christmas is long gone by now. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it. Could pick that rubbish up.
Yeah, Robert's on it.
Come on.
Come on, Harry.
Robert. Come on, let's get going.
On it. How much of that?
Hello. Hey?
Okay, I get it. You tried to escape. Now you want me to think you're having some sort of medical crisis. You're more clever than you look.
No.
Okay.
Pills.
Okay. You're tachycardic. That's not good. You said pills. Where are they?
Jackie.
Hold it. Under your tongue. That's it. Come on. Come on. I'm not letting you go anywhere.
You okay?
Yeah.
You seemed rattled before.
Oh, no, it's nothing. I just shiver from the cold.
Okay, so you're not worrying about Kev? Because you were right. I'm not gonna let him get to us. We've got so much to look forward to. To us?
Yeah, I'll drink to that.
You had me worried for a moment there. Oh, you're welcome, by the way. No need to thank me. You were only begging for my help.
Why did you bother?
What can I say? It's Christmas. I'm feeling all toasty inside. Oh no, wait. You, my new plan A. Jealous ex with a history of violence, kills husband in a crime of passion. It's well, it's got a certain ring to it.
I take it you do the killing for me.
Oh, you catch on fast. Then you're found, having turned the gun on yourself, a neat little note explaining what you did. Star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Julius. Then I swoop in and save Aaron.
Unless, of course, I stop you.
Are we still doing this? You don't have to play the big man with me. I've saved your life. So I figure you owe it back to me. I want you ready for action. Eat.